Thank you very much. First of all, Lauren, I'd just like to ask you, how much time am I allotted for my presentation roughly? 40 minutes. Perfect. I'll set up here. This timer I have on my phone is necessary because I get into the habit of speaking well over my time and then people have to prompt me to wrap up. So hopefully that won't be the case today. I have a timer on my phone letting me know how much time I have left. So thank you so much for that lovely introduction. The title of my presentation today is similar to that of my thesis. My thesis itself focused on the whole of Ireland at the same time frame as this presentation, but today I'm going to focus on Belfast specifically and what I found in my research that is related specifically to Belfast. So I've created the presentation around that. Now, I'm not an expert on all things Belfast in terms of history, and I wouldn't be an expert in the Belfast deaf community as such, but through my research, I would have found some very interesting information that I wanted to share with you today from Belfast. And if any of the information turns out to be wrong or you think is somewhat inaccurate, do let me know because I am open to that. So as the deaf community members here would already be aware of, a lot of this information may be familiar to you, but for some people who wouldn't have heard, the word deaf is the culturally appropriate term that we use. The four terms that would have been used would be deaf and dumb. That's now considered very offensive. But at the time that I'm speaking about in my research, the phrases deaf and dumb were frequently used and accepted, and deaf people themselves would identify as deaf and dumb. So it's a very different time we're talking about in terms of political correctness and the terminology that was accepted. But at the time, it was widely used. Other words that and terminology that I would like to go through just is the phrase dummy. And again, considered very offensive now, but at that time, and in the hearing world, currently, you see a decline in that terminology used anyway, currently, but at the time I'm talking about, in newspapers, articles, a lot of the papers I would be looking for do frequently use the word dummy. Interesting about the word dumb is that now, again, it's not used much in general context. You know, deaf people who, or people who can hear but cannot speak might be described as dumb, but in Ireland, it seems like that it meant that people who were deaf and dumb, but they would have just shortened it to the word dumb to describe both people who are deaf and dumb. So when I first came across that word and then investigated further, it came out that those people would have attended deaf school. So it doesn't always mean a person who could hear but couldn't speak. It generally meant people who were deaf also. Again, I'm sure most of you would be familiar with this in terms of the deaf community. But those who aren't aware of what the deaf community is, it's the deaf population who would use sign language and the community that evolved around that. So would socialize, would have similar experiences in terms of attending a deaf school together, and that's how the deaf community would have been formed. In Northern Ireland, or NID would have said 7,500 people roughly would use British Sign Language or Irish Sign Language. Maybe now it's different in terms of the statistics, I'm not sure, but from the research, it looks like the current figure is around 7,500. And I've mentioned two sign languages, it's British Sign Language and Irish Sign Language. So deaf people who are present here today would already be aware of this, but British Sign Language and Irish Sign Language are real languages. They are not just English on the hands where you would sign word for word. They are in their own right, grammatically different languages with their own grammar, structure and culture. And British Sign Language and ISL are very distinctly different. So as you can see, there's two different languages being used here in terms of sign languages and English as spoken language. You may see in America, they have ASL, American Sign Language, which would again be very distinct from British Sign Language or Irish Sign Language. In the Republic of Ireland, we have the ISL Act, which passed in 2017, officially recognising Irish Sign Language as a language, which is a great piece of legislation to have because it will have significant improvements for the deaf community in Ireland. And in Northern Ireland, there is a new BSL ISL bill going through the Assembly at the moment, thank you. And hopefully that will progress to become a significant piece of legislation for the Northern Ireland deaf community also. The deaf schools were a crucial factor for the deaf community because without the deaf schools, we're not too sure if there would be such a strong deaf community. Children would have went to deaf schools, attained their education, socialised, met their peers, and then moved home to their locality again afterwards and maybe to the hometowns, but there was still that connection to the deaf community and meeting up with friends afterwards because they could communicate in their first language. In 1816, the first deaf school opened, and after that, several other deaf schools followed suit. It's quite hard to read here because it's quite small, so you might need a pair of binoculars, apologies, but I'm happy to send on the PowerPoint afterwards to you. And those schools that opened, one was based in Cabra in Dublin. So there was two schools based in Cabra, a separate one for boys and girls, St. Joseph's and St. Mary's schools, but they were just known altogether as the Cabra schools. And that was a Catholic institution for deaf children. Then there was also a school in Belfast that opened on the Lisburn Road. And that was opened in 1831, as Ronnie had mentioned. Thank you. School in Belfast, unfortunately, the building that no longer exists. That opened in 1831 and then moved to the Lisburn Road in 1845. But I do feel that most of you would be more familiar in terms of this than I am. And I might be mentioning things that you're already very aware of, so apologies if that is the case. But these photographs are from the annual report, where you can see the drawing, so the front cover there, the drawing of the building itself. And for many years, deaf children would have attended this institution and met other deaf people and learned their sign language from each other and be passed on generation to generation and then spread amongst the community over time. However, when the deaf schools opened, you may be wondering if it actually affected literacy. And for the total of Ireland, the statistics in terms of the progression of literacy skills across deaf children was very slow. You may have thought once children have access to these schools that all of a sudden that'll be great, all these kids will be able to read and write, but unfortunately it was very slow in progressing. Over the west and northwest and kind of southwest, there were still a lot of problems, but you can see that from the 1900s, there was that crossing where most deaf people could get to the stage of reading and writing. Whereas before that, most deaf people would have had no education. So you might think from 1831, once the schools were established, that people would be able to sign fluently and write fluently, but unfortunately that didn't really happen until the 1900s. So there are also cases where deaf children didn't attend the school, and you might wonder why. So in 1831, a new system for education was introduced. It specifically affected hearing children, but it was really education for all, but just deaf people never really got the benefit of that system, because each town would have funding from the government to allow children to attend schools. So they would build these schools, pay for teachers, and mainstream children could attend. So in theory, all children could attend a school, in theory. But for deaf children, they could attend that school, but unfortunately, they wouldn't know what's going on because they wouldn't have access to the language. But there were already deaf schools established. Unfortunately, they were not free. You had to pay a fee to attend those schools. And those schools may have also been charitable organizations, so they would have done fundraisers to collect money and donations with the aim and intention of having sufficient funding to pay for the accommodation, the boarding for the students to attend. But in reality, the funds that they raised weren't sufficient, and they ended up having to charge fees for people to attend those schools. So even though the deaf schools were established, poor deaf children didn't automatically have the privilege to attend those schools. But there was a new law enacted in 1843 in relation to the Poor Law. And that meant that local organisations, the boards of guardians, could help pay for the funding to send a child to a deaf school if they met that threshold of poverty. So things did improve, but the problem was that the board of guardians, and you may be wondering who would have sat on the board of guardians. I will get into that later. But they had the power to deliberate and decide to assign the funding, but it was not compulsory. It was at their own discretion, and they could decide not to. So if they felt that the family could afford those fees, they would stipulate that they would have to pay for it themselves. So it really depends on the family's circumstances and the board of guardians' view on whether or not they could afford to do that. Some people were fortunate enough to get their fees paid, some were not. And what happened over the years was that sometimes families would agree to pay half, and the board of guardians would also contribute half, or 1/3, 2/3, whatever it was that they saw fit. And sometimes the board of guardians would just give an outright no and wouldn't contribute at all, and then the parents couldn't afford to actually send the child for a deaf education.
Of course, the Board of Guardians here in Belfast, maybe you're thinking that they had a positive attitude in regards to deaf children, but you can see here, the Board of Guardians in Belfast did actually pay for a number of deaf children and blind children to attend these schools. And for example, you can see in this article here, from 1880, there was 21 children. And the Board of Guardians here in Belfast did pay for those children to attend the schools. This information here at the bottom is from the Catholic Institute for Deaf People. And if the Catholic children were here in the Belfast area, the Board of Guardians would provide funding in these various different years. And by 1912, there was 50 children who were sent to the deaf schools in Cabra by the Belfast Board of Guardians. And you can see just from the newspaper article there on the right-hand side, the Lisburn Road School, every year they had a meeting and they issued a report. And in that report, they had said that the other Board of Guardians around Belfast, around different areas, were very poor in providing funding for deaf children to attend schools. But this particular area of Belfast, they were very prosperous. They did send a load of deaf children to the schools, and they provided funding to make sure that deaf children could attend the schools and receive their education. And as there were a variety of different deaf schools around Ireland, some deaf children went to school, they were educated in different areas, some deaf children did not go to school. And because of this rich variety of language, especially with the Catholic deaf children who went to school in Cabra, they attended the Cabra deaf schools, and as there were two buildings for the boys and girls, St. Mary's and St. Joseph's, when they were acquiring ISL, both ISL was used in both schools, but there was a variation within the boys' school and the girls' school. So St. Joseph's, they would have the boys' sign, the men's sign, and St. Mary's would have a female variation. And often this led to miscommunication further along when they would meet up outside of the school and have different variations of ISL. Dublin did actually have one Protestant school, Claremont Deaf School. And the Lisburn Road School had a very similar kind of in Strabane, the deaf school there. They would have used a very similar variation of sign language, and the ex-pupils of these schools would meet up, they would travel, they would socialise after. They would use a sign language that was like BSL, but innate for Ireland. And my label, I would refer to that as Northern Ireland BSL or Irish BSL. But now that variation of sign is very prominent within Northern Ireland. But within other parts of Ireland, it is no longer in use. And you'll see the green label here. Some deaf children never attended school. And they would use their own home sign within their family, within their locality to communicate. And it wasn't a rich form of language. And sometimes, often within the families, they would have a number of deaf children, or they would have deaf people within the localities that would get together and would sign together, and it would become almost like a village sign language. And recent research within other countries, the global south countries, some areas, very remote areas, small villages where there is no schools for deaf, there is evidence of children or people signing and amongst the communities, and there is languages present there. So it's not just a form of home sign, but it is an actual language. So maybe this was the case a very long time ago here. Of course, there is some recent examples. I suppose maybe if there are hearing people who are watching the TV, maybe you can see that there's two interpreters sometimes. And that is because there is the ISL interpreter and the BSL interpreters, you can see. And here in Northern Ireland, BSL is different to BSL in Scotland and England. It is a different variety, and of course, the attendees here would know more than me in regards to that. And the period of time that I have researched from 1850 to 1920, the population of Belfast did expand. There was new factories that opened, new jobs that became available that encouraged people to travel to Belfast for work. And the deaf community here in Belfast continued on that same trend. It did expand over the course of the years. So it's very interesting to compare to the deaf community within Dublin. So often what is the case, people would assume that Dublin had a very big deaf community, that it would have been the majority deaf community. But you can see here the figures below. Dublin City, the level of deaf people who were there remained fairly consistent. There was no a sharp increase, but in Belfast, that is not the case, and it did have a massive expansion. So around 1911, Belfast deaf community was actually the biggest deaf community within Ireland. So I'm sure, again, you know more than me in regards to this next part, but this is a very well-known institute for deaf people. So it first opened, but not in this location, in Fisherwaite Place in Dublin 7, number 7 in Belfast. In and around the 1880s, and then it moved in 1906 to this particular location here. And for a very long time, a number of years, deaf people came to this institute. It became the mission hall, and they came for different activities, sports, and that was very ongoing. And later on, it became Wilton House. And it closed for a while, for a period of time, until recently the premises was purchased and it became apartments, new apartments. So you can see the comparison there between the old building and the new. And this is just a little list of various activities that they would have carried out within the mission hall. And I'm always shocked, I know, when I'm reading through the reports, that just the variety of that they had. They had something on every day of the week and people attended, and it was very busy, which was brilliant. And of course, I'm sure you know this man well. He is a very important figure within the community, Francis McGinn. And he was a coordinator of Mission Hall. So he was involved in setting up a lot of different things back at that time. And you'll see his face throughout this presentation. And this is just one example of the deaf culture. They wanted to show the deaf drama. And this was the 100-year anniversary of the birth of Charles Dickens. And they decided to get together and coordinate a drama. And the newspaper went, they took a photo, and they wrote an article about it. And sign language, if you can imagine back at that time, the deaf schools, there wasn't a focus on sign language. They wanted an oralist method, and there was signing previously, but that was banned and education was done through oralism. But deaf people were still proud of their sign language. And on the front page of this particular newspaper, the Lorraine Times, they showed an example of sign language. So you'll see Francis McGinn there, and Ben Payne. And both were Irish deaf. So it should be the Daily Telegraph. So the sign there is day, or daily, and telegraph. But what is very interesting is that you can see the sign here. So I don't know this particular sign, maybe that the current sign for day, the sign at that time, maybe it was an old sign for day. And then the telegraph, the handshake there, it's quite hard to see. So I think this might be what they are trying to sign. So you can remember the old machine there for the telegraph. But what is important is that the deaf community weren't embarrassed of sign language. They were very proud of it. They wanted it on the front page and they were proud of their language. So the deaf community had their own clubs, hubs and societies, and this is one in particular. And you can see the sash, it's not the orange order, it's not a religious outfit. It is a friendly society. So you could join, and every week you would pay a membership fee. And then if something happened, if you were injured, if you were sick, or if there was a death and needed a funeral to be paid, then they would assist with funding. And when it was first set up, a lot of deaf people started to join and the membership got bigger. And then in 1893, by Francis McGinn. So it continued and in quite a successful way for a very long time. It wasn't a designated deaf organisation, but it was a wider organisation that a lot of deaf people were members of. But it had one specific branch for deaf. And this particular organisation was throughout the UK, through England, Scotland, Wales, but there was no designated deaf branch of it.
There was deaf football clubs that remained very active. There was a Belfast team playing against Glasgow in this photo. And one person who was involved, again, as you can imagine, was himself here. Who do you think that is? Francis McGinn. Yeah. And just to explain both photos here on screen. So there's the Catholic Deaf Club at Dublin and the Belfast Deaf Mission. So if you look at them side by side, and I just want to talk a little bit about the religious aspect of it. Across Ireland, Catholic people would have had their own specific clubs that were Catholic clubs, and sometimes they would have been split into men and women. They would never mix, they'd be quite segregated in that sense, and they would have been ISL users. And myself, through my research, looking at that specific time frame before the 1920s, there wasn't much mixing. It wasn't that there was a hard and fast separation there about Protestants and Catholics mixing, but there just didn't seem to be the case. People would be civil and pleasant, but they wouldn't really mix. So there was that separation in the deaf communities at the time. People were polite, but separate. And I think the situation, though, specifically in Belfast, was quite different to the rest of Ireland, because there was that mixing, and there's evidence of that. I don't know if you'd be aware, in 1912, the Ulster Covenant, where thousands of people gathered to sign up to oppose Home Rule. They didn't want a Dublin Parliament set up to rule Ireland, and people signed a petition, the Ulster Covenant, against it. There were many well-known buildings that were used for people to go and register in, and the Mission Hall was one of those buildings. See here? And here are a list of people who registered within the Mission Hall. So 1250 people registered their names in opposition, and top of the list, Francis McGinn. And many other deaf people also signed up. At that time, there was a lot of political clashes going on, and there was obviously, it slightly influenced what was happening in the Mission Hall too. But the Mission Hall never became something, a place that excluded other people. Every year they would create reports in the Mission Hall of the members who would regularly attend it, and all of that would have been documented. for those who were Church of Ireland, Methodist, Presbyterian, and Catholic. So it's very clear that the mission hall never excluded any particular group and welcomed everyone into the hall. And it's interesting, there's also some Jewish members. So it was very open to all faiths. Again, another example here in terms of housing. And a lot of deaf people would have shared houses, so homes together. So, but a very multi-denominational home with different religions all sharing the space. So there's a woman here, Sarah Irvine, and she had domestic duties at home. She was of the boarding house. Her son, Seth. Yeah, so her son's name was Saint John Irvine, and he was a well-known drama writer in Belfast, but he would have lived in that home with deaf people too. And you see like that there was very much an openness there for people of different religions to share a space together, live together, which is a lovely thought. So the photo here isn't great quality, but there were regular matches played against the Dublin deaf team and the Belfast deaf team, so they would have often engaged in great sportsmanship. And this particular photo was in St. Joseph's School in Cabra. And who is this front and centre? Of course, yes. Himself again, yeah. And just to talk about the poor laws. It used to be solely specifically about education and paying for education. Excuse me, it wasn't just before I talk about the poor law and how it relates to education. It also applies to the workhouse. So I just want to talk, I suppose, overall about the poor law system in Ireland. From 1838, Ireland needed to do something about the levels of poverty and desperation in society. So we decided to incorporate the same system that we have in Wales and Scotland, where there was 130 different areas, so poor law unions set up across the country, and there was one workhouse per union. The Board of Guardians would have controlled these workhouses, and they would have been funded by local tax that was used to fund and support the running of these workhouses. Within Northern Ireland, these are the different poor law unions that would have been established. The Belfast one, over here on the right. And the workhouses are different to this house specifically, the poorhouse, Clifton House, that Ronnie had spoken to, and the fact that it wasn't state funded or publicly funded. Whereas these workhouses, the workhouse system at that time, would have been the Board of Guardians who would have run it. It would have been funded by poor rates. And at the time, people did not want to enter the workhouse. It was a horrible place to have to go. The food was awful. It would have been cold. It would have been dirty. But if a family found themselves in desperate times, where they had nothing to eat and couldn't find work, and they had to subject themselves to entering the workhouse, men, women, and children would have all been separated. So you would have been separated from your family upon entering. It was also a hard life in the workhouse. The work was hard. The rules were tough. If you broke a rule, you were severely punished. So it was a very awful place to be, and people did not want to do it. It was a last resort option. But there were hospitals adjoining the workhouses after 1862. And at that time, the hospitals were free to access with no fees attached. So people maybe didn't want to go to the workhouse, but if they found themselves sick or injured, they wanted to avail of the hospital services for free. So they went through the workhouse system so they could access the hospitals. The Belfast workhouse is very near to Lisburn Road School, as you can see from the map here. And at the time, there would have been several buildings surrounding this, but they've all been demolished. Some of them could still be standing, but the majority of them are gone. And this building is still part of the current hospital. So it was linked to the workhouse. So this was a specialist hospital for fever at the time. And into the 1900s, around 1905, you would see this on the left-hand side here, a gathering of old men in the Belfast workhouse. And on the right, it's the children's ward. And that photo is at Christmas time. And if you see it far at the back there, a figure that resembles some kind of Santa Claus. Now, a scary kind of Santa Claus, but it's supposed to be Santa nonetheless. Those who would have entered the Belfast workhouse would have been detailed in a register, and it would have documented when they arrived, when they left, how long they stayed. And I would have looked through these registers to find out examples of a lot of deaf people who would have entered the workhouse. So as you can see from here, I've just picked 1 year. It was 1888 that's shown here on this slide. And you can see some people who would have been in once, twice, or a few times. Sometimes people would have been in and out every few days. They might stay only a couple of days and then return. Some people went in and stayed for a very long time, a case of years sometimes. So you can see the variety here as an example. Interestingly, there's this example of a deaf woman, Susan Sparks, who had attended the Lisburn Road School. And when I was doing my research, I came across her name again and again, and I documented every instance of her name I found over the space of 27 months. Maybe she would have been in before and after again, but this is just one specific time frame. And they would have been very short stays. She would have been in and out for a week, 2 weeks. Sometimes she'd be out and back in the same day. Could have been to do with poverty. It could have been her leaving to see if any work was available. And then if she couldn't find work, she was begging to get food, was having no joy, and ended up back in the workhouse again. Stay for a period of time, and then chance her arm again, try her luck, and then end up back in again. So this is another kind of pattern I would have identified through my research. This man here, James Lyon, again, would have attended Lisburn Road School. When he left school, he first entered the workhouse in 1891, and then stayed until his death. The census of 1901 and 1911 would have mentioned his name, but they were spelled differently in both. So, but I could have identified based on the fact that he was deaf and dumb in both that it was the same person. It was James Lyons. He died in 1932, excuse me. And the workhouse remained open for a very long time. A lot of them would have closed in the 1940s, but others did remain open. These are excerpts from 1901 census, 1911 census, and his death certificate. So if you find the documentation to make those connections, you can kind of piece together a story from that. I'm not sure where he was buried. He could have been buried on the workhouse grounds or in another place. I haven't come across that in my research, but if anyone here is interested in
So everything that I have talked about so far, that doesn't mean that the research is all complete. There is much more that still can be done. This particular organisation, PRONI, PRONI, they are a great source of documentation. So if you are interested, you can go in and you can do your own research. They have records of the registers from workhouses, and it's plentiful there. And of course, there is a lot of workhouse records that are missing or are not present, but from the south. But within Northern Ireland, the records have been very well kept, and you can order them and have a look through and make a note of different workhouse attendees who have been deaf throughout the years. So you can see the information for all of these areas is in PRONI. So maybe if one of these is close to your local home area, you might be interested in looking a bit further into that. And as Ronnie had said, and Lauren will know all too well, here within Clifton House, people who attended, there was deaf people, and their names are present in the admission book. So it is a great source of research. And I know just even hearing that information today is very interesting. So if it sparks an interest within yourself, you're more than welcome to look further into it. So I know time is a little bit against me at the moment, so I'm hurrying towards the end. But I just want to say thank you very much for your listening ears. And if you have any questions, I am more than happy to answer them.